The orphanage stood at the edge of a forgotten town, a stone monument to the past. Its towering spires seemed to scrape the gray skies, casting long shadows over the surrounding countryside. For generations, it had been a place where children were brought, abandoned, or left behind. The town itself had once thrived, but now, it felt as though time itself had chosen to bypass this corner of the world. The roads leading to the orphanage were worn and barely visible, as if nature itself was intent on reclaiming the ground the building had once dominated. Yet, despite its bleak and imposing appearance, the orphanage was not entirely devoid of life. A new batch of children arrived on the first day of autumn, their small faces a mixture of fear and curiosity. Most were young, no older than 10, and many had been abandoned by parents who were unable or unwilling to care for them. The older children clung to one another, their eyes darting around the unfamiliar halls, already sensing that something was amiss. The staff, a collection of stern-faced women in drab uniforms, seemed cold and distant, offering little comfort to the nervous newcomers. Their eyes, however, betrayed a different story, a quiet, unsettling knowing, as if they were privy to some truth the children were yet to understand. It was the headmistress, Miss Alma, who greeted them with a warm but calculated smile. She appeared to be in her late 50s, her tall frame draped in an old-fashioned black dress with a lace collar. Despite her kind tone, something about her felt off. There was a stillness to her presence, an unnatural calmness that hung in the air. "Welcome to your new home," she said, her voice smooth as honey, yet empty. "Here, you will be cared for and protected. The orphanage is a place of refuge, where you will grow, learn, and in time, find your place in the world." The children were ushered inside, their steps hesitant on the cold stone floors. The building's interior was dim, lit by flickering chandeliers that cast eerie shadows on the walls. As they walked down the long corridors, the children couldn't help but notice the portraits hanging on every wall. Portraits of children, of faces that seemed strangely familiar, but impossible to place. Each portrait had a name and a date beneath it, but some were worn and faded, as though the years had taken their toll on the once vibrant images. In the grand hall, Miss Alma gestured toward the staircase that led up to the upper floors. "Your rooms are waiting for you," she announced. The children hesitated, a chill creeping up their spines as they took in the unsettling atmosphere. "You will be well taken care of here," Miss Alma repeated, but her words did little to calm their nerves. A cold draft swept through the hall, and the distant sound of a door creaking echoed through the building. The children exchanged uneasy glances, but said nothing. They had little choice but to follow her lead. Upstairs, the children were assigned to their rooms. Some of the rooms were large, with 4 or 5 beds, while others were smaller and contained just 1 or 2. As they settled in, each child noticed the strange absence of any personal touches in the rooms. No toys, no books, no decorations. The walls were bare, and the beds were made with crisp, white linens that felt too sterile, too impersonal. There was a sense of emptiness that lingered in the air, as if the rooms themselves had been abandoned long ago, left to gather dust until the next group of orphans arrived. That night, as the children lay in their beds, the silence of the orphanage pressed down on them like a weight. The sounds of distant footsteps echoed through the halls, but no one dared to venture out. The walls seemed to breathe, the old wood creaking and groaning under some invisible weight. The children pulled the covers tighter around themselves, each one desperate to ignore the feeling of being watched, of something lurking just beyond their reach. Every so often, a soft whisper would drift through the cracks in the walls, like a voice calling them, but no one dared to listen. As the hours passed, a feeling of unease settled over the orphanage like a thick fog. For the first time, the children began to realize that this place, for all its size and grandeur, was not a sanctuary. It was a prison of secrets, of histories long buried. And as they closed their eyes, a sinking feeling grew within them, knowing that they had stepped into a place where the past had not been forgotten. It was simply waiting for them to discover its dark truths. Miss Alma's voice, soft and calculating, echoed in their minds. "You will be cared for here," she had promised. But in the dead of night, they couldn't help but wonder. Cared for? By whom? And why did it feel as though the building itself had a life of its own, watching, waiting, and listening? And so, the first night passed in uneasy slumber. The children lay still, their minds filled with questions, but none dared to speak them aloud. For in that moment, they all sensed the same thing, a presence hidden beneath the surface, lurking in the shadows of the orphanage. As the days passed, the children of the orphanage began to settle into their new lives, but the unease from the first night lingered. They quickly learned the routine of the orphanage, the rigid schedule of meals, lessons, and the occasional moment of freedom in the small courtyard. The days seemed to bleed into one another, each one indistinguishable from the last. Yet, it was during the quiet moments, when the lights dimmed and the halls emptied, that the children started to notice something strange, something they couldn't quite explain. At night, when the other children fell asleep, the older ones would lie awake, straining their ears in the oppressive silence. The walls, which once seemed immovable and cold, began to hum with a low, distant sound. It was a soft whisper, so faint at first that they wondered if it was merely a trick of the mind. But as the days went on, the whispers grew louder, more distinct. They spoke in a language none of the children recognized, but there was an undeniable sense of urgency in the tone. It was as if the walls themselves were trying to communicate with them, urging them to listen, to understand. One night, as the whispers intensified, a group of older children, Lily, Thomas, and Emma, decided to investigate. They had all noticed the strange sounds at different times, but it was only now that they dared to acknowledge it. They gathered near the common area, their eyes darting nervously as they listened for any sign of movement. The usual sounds of the orphanage, creaking doors, the distant footsteps of a night watchman, were absent. Only the whispers filled the air, like the breath of something ancient and unseen. Lily, the most daring of the group, was the first to speak. "We need to find out where it's coming from," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the hum of the walls. Thomas nodded, his face pale, but there was something in his eyes, a glimmer of both fear and curiosity, that spurred him to follow her. Emma hesitated, but after a moment, she too agreed. They were bound by a shared sense of unease, but also by an undeniable need to uncover the truth. They crept down the narrow hallway, the sound of their footsteps muffled by the thick carpets beneath their feet. The whispers seemed to come from every direction, making it difficult to pinpoint their source. At first, they assumed the sound was emanating from one of the rooms, but when they tried to open the doors, they found them locked, as usual. There was no one inside. The whispers continued unabated, wrapping around them like an invisible thread. Finally, they reached the far end of the hall, where a set of heavy wooden doors stood ajar. The air in front of them seemed to shimmer, as if something was distorting the space itself. As they approached the doors, the whispers grew louder, more insistent. It was as if the walls were pleading with them, urging them to enter. A cold chill swept over the children, but they pushed forward, their curiosity outweighing their fear. The room beyond the door was dimly lit, the only light coming from a single, flickering candle on a table in the center of the room. The walls, lined with old shelves, seemed to close in on them, casting long shadows that seemed to shift and twist. There was an oppressive weight in the air, as if the room had been waiting for them. As they stepped further into the room, the whispers stopped, abruptly, leaving only silence in their wake. It was then that they noticed the markings on the walls. Faint, almost imperceptible at first, were symbols carved into the stone, symbols that seemed to pulse with an otherworldly energy. Lily ran her fingers over one of them, feeling a strange warmth radiating from the surface. "What are these?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Thomas stepped closer, squinting at the symbols. "I don't know," he replied, his voice thick with awe and fear. "But I think they're trying to tell us something. These aren't just random marks." Emma, her face pale and drawn, looked around the room. "This place feels wrong," she muttered. "Like it's alive, like it's been waiting for us." Suddenly, The door behind them slammed shut with a deafening crash. The children spun around in panic, but the door remained firmly closed. The whispers returned, louder now, as if the walls themselves were speaking directly into their minds. The room seemed to grow colder, the shadows deepening. It was as though the very air had become thick with dread, suffocating them with its oppressive presence. Panic began to take hold, but before they could react, the sound of footsteps echoed from the hallway outside. The children froze, their hearts racing. They knew they had been discovered. They rushed to the door, desperately trying to open it, but it would not budge. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, as if warning them of something terrible. It was then that they heard a voice, not from the walls, but from behind them. A soft but unmistakable voice, low and filled with sorrow. "You shouldn't have come here," it whispered. "The walls remember. They always remember." The children spun around, their eyes wide with terror, but there was no one in the room with them. The voice, however, lingered, echoing in their minds as if it had never left. In that moment, they realized that the orphanage was not just a building. It was something far more ancient, far more malevolent. It was a place that fed on fear, a place where memories and whispers were trapped forever within its walls. They scrambled to open the door, finally succeeding in their frantic attempts. As they burst into the hallway, they found themselves back where they had started, but everything felt different. The orphanage, once merely an unsettling structure, now seemed alive, as if it were watching them, waiting for them to make their next move. The children quickly returned to their rooms, their minds spinning with the horror they had just experienced. But deep down, they knew that the orphanage's secrets were far from over, and they had only just begun to scratch the surface. And so, the whispers continued, their presence a constant reminder that the orphanage was not just a home for lost children. It was a prison for something far darker, something that had been waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. After their disturbing encounter in the hidden room, the trio of children, Lily, Thomas, and Emma, spent the following days in a near-constant state of unease. The whispers that had once seemed merely strange were now a constant presence in their minds, creeping through the very fabric of the orphanage. The walls no longer felt like solid, inanimate structures. They felt alive. Every night, as darkness swallowed the halls, the three of them would lie awake, staring into the oppressive shadows, waiting for the whispers to return. But it wasn't just the whispers that began to haunt them. There was something in the eyes of the younger children, something unsettling that none of them could quite explain. At first, it was subtle, an occasional glance, a fleeting look. But as time went on, the children started to notice that they were always being watched. Wherever they went, the eyes of the younger orphans followed them. These eyes weren't curious or innocent. They were filled with a strange understanding, a cold knowledge that felt out of place in children so young. One afternoon, while playing in the courtyard, Emma turned to see a group of children huddled near the farthest corner, whispering among themselves. She could hear their voices, high-pitched and soft, but the words didn't seem to make sense. As she approached them, they all fell silent and turned to face her, their eyes dark and intense. Emma froze, a chill running down her spine as she realized that there was something wrong with the way they looked at her. "They're not like us," Lily said, her voice barely audible. "I think they know something we don't." Thomas nodded solemnly, his gaze lingering on the children, who now stood perfectly still, not moving a muscle. The trio exchanged uneasy glances, then slowly turned away from the children. But as they walked back toward the main building, they couldn't shake the feeling that they were being followed, that those eyes were always there, watching them from the corners of their vision. It was as if the younger orphans were always aware of their every movement, waiting for them to slip up, to give in to the mounting pressure that was building within the walls. That evening, after the other children had gone to bed, Lily, Thomas, and Emma gathered in their room, huddled together in an attempt to make sense of everything they had experienced. They spoke in hushed tones, fearful that the walls might be listening. "There's something wrong with this place," Thomas said, his voice shaking slightly. "Those kids, they're not normal. They know things. They're watching us, Emma whispered. I feel like they're waiting for something. Lily's eyes narrowed as she looked out the window. I think they're connected to the orphanage in some way. Maybe they've been here longer than we think. Maybe they're part of it. As the night wore on, the strange sense of unease only grew. The building, which had once felt like a prison, now felt like a maze, one that the children were trapped within, with no clear way out. Even the air in the room felt heavier, as if it were pressing down on them, suffocating them with its silent weight. The following day, the children decided to investigate further. They had to know what the younger orphans knew, what they were hiding. They knew they couldn't trust the staff. Miss Alma had made her indifference to their well-being clear. They were on their own, and they had no choice but to dig deeper into the secrets of the orphanage. They ventured through the halls, careful not to make a sound, moving in shadows as if the walls themselves might betray their every step. They reached the basement, an area they had been warned to avoid. Miss Alma had told them stories of the basement's old storage and the dangerous things that were kept there. But the children, driven by a need to understand, couldn't ignore it any longer. They pried open the door to the basement, their hands trembling as they descended into the darkness. The air in the basement was thick and musty, filled with the scent of damp earth and old wood. The light from their candle flickered in the oppressive dark, casting long, eerie shadows on the walls. As they made their way deeper into the basement, their hearts pounding in their chests, they noticed something strange. The walls of the basement were covered in scraps of old paper, yellowed and torn with age. The papers were scattered everywhere, on the floor, on the shelves, even nailed to the walls. And scrawled on each sheet were the same words, repeated over and over again. The children's eyes remember. Lily's breath caught in her throat as she picked up one of the papers, her fingers trembling as she read the words aloud. "What does this mean?" she whispered, her voice barely audible in the silence. Thomas and Emma crowded around her, their faces pale as they read the words again. "I don't know," Thomas replied, his voice shaking. "But it sounds like a warning." Emma felt a wave of nausea wash over her as she backed away from the papers, her eyes darting nervously to the corners of the room. Something about the basement felt wrong, as if the very air was charged with a terrible, unspoken presence. Suddenly, the sound of footsteps echoed through the basement. The children froze, their hearts racing. They weren't alone. The door at the top of the stairs slammed shut with a force that rattled the walls, trapping them in the basement. The whispers, which had been quiet for so long, returned in full force, echoing in their minds like a chorus of voices. The children scrambled to the door, pulling and pushing, but it wouldn't budge. And then, from the darkness, they heard it, a voice, faint but unmistakable, calling out to them. "The children's eyes see all," it whispered. "You cannot escape their gaze." In a panic, they managed to force open the door, tumbling out of the basement and into the safety of the hallway. The whispers still clung to their ears, lingering like an invisible fog. The children knew they had just uncovered a small piece of the mystery, but it was enough to terrify them. The orphanage was no longer just a place of discomfort. It had become something far more sinister, a place where the past and present were tangled together, and where the eyes of the children seemed to hold a power that none of them could comprehend. The question now was not what the orphanage was hiding, but how much they could bear to uncover before it was too late. The walls were watching, and so were the children. As the days passed, the strange occurrences at the orphanage began to mount. The children felt as though they were being pulled deeper into an unexplainable web, one where they had no control. The whispers, the cold stares, the feeling of being watched, they were no longer isolated events, but a constant presence in their lives. The orphanage, once a place of fear and sadness, had transformed into something far more sinister, something that seemed to exist beyond the boundaries of the living world. Despite their growing fear, Lily, Thomas, and Emma could not shake the feeling that they were on the cusp of something important, something that would finally explain the strange happenings. The papers in the basement, the cryptic message the children's eyes remember, haunted them in their waking hours. What could it mean? Why had it been written everywhere? And more importantly, What was the connection between the younger orphans and the secrets buried within the walls? But the answer, it seemed, would not come easily. In fact, it would come in a way that none of them could have predicted, through a lullaby. One evening, as the children lay in their beds, the familiar sounds of the orphanage, creaking floors, the distant rustle of shifting papers, suddenly gave way to something else. A soft, haunting melody echoed through the halls, its mournful tune drifting into their rooms like a wisp of smoke. It was a lullaby, one that seemed to come from nowhere, yet filled every corner of the orphanage with its chilling notes. Lily, unable to resist the pull of the melody, quietly slipped out of bed and crept down the hall. Thomas and Emma, sensing her movements, followed without a word. The lullaby grew louder, more insistent, as they moved through the darkened hallways, the sound seeming to guide them toward a specific destination. They didn't know why, but something told them that they needed to follow the song, that it would lead them to the truth they had been seeking. As they reached the farthest wing of the orphanage, they found themselves standing in front of a door they had never seen before. It was old, its wood darkened with age, and covered in dust. The door seemed to pulse with an eerie energy, and the lullaby came from behind it, faint but unmistakable. "This is it," Lily whispered, her voice trembling with a mix of excitement and fear. "This is where it leads." But Thomas hesitated. "Are we sure we should go in? What if it's a trap?" Emma's voice was barely audible. "We've come this far. We have to know." With a deep breath, Lily pushed open the door, and the children stepped into the room beyond. It was small, with a low ceiling, and filled with dust and cobwebs. The air was thick with the weight of abandonment, as though the room had not been touched in years. But what struck them most were the walls, covered, once again, with the same scrawled words they had seen in the basement. The children's eyes remember. The lullaby grew louder, surrounding them like a living thing. It seemed to emanate from all around them, echoing off the walls, filling their minds with its strange, hypnotic rhythm. The melody was sweet, comforting even, but it carried an underlying sorrow, one that made their hearts ache with a sorrow they couldn't fully comprehend. As the children stood there, frozen in the center of the room, something stirred in the shadows. The room seemed to shift, to grow darker, as if the very walls were closing in on them. And then, from the corner of the room, something moved. A figure, pale and translucent, appeared before them. It was a child, or at least it looked like one. Its features were blurred as though caught in a fog, and its eyes, those eyes, stared at the children with a depth that felt impossible, as though they were seeing through them, into their very souls. "The eyes remember," the figure whispered, its voice barely more than a breath. "You've come too late," Lily gasped, stepping back in fear. Thomas clutched her arm, his heart racing. "Who are you? What do you mean?" The figure's lips twisted into a sorrowful smile. "We were all lost here. We are the forgotten ones. The children whose eyes hold the truth, but whose voices have been silenced." The lullaby, once so sweet, now carried an undercurrent of despair, and the air in the room grew colder, heavier, as if the very atmosphere was pressing in on them. The figure raised its hand, pointing to the walls, where a new message had appeared. "The truth is hidden in the lullaby. The lullaby is our story," the figure continued, its voice echoing in the children's minds. "It is a song of the past, a song of the lost children who came before you. The eyes remember everything. They see the secrets of this place, of what lies beneath the walls." The children, now trembling with fear, exchanged panicked looks. They had known there was something hidden in the orphanage, something dark and ancient, but they had never imagined it could be tied to the children themselves, those who had once lived there, those who had been forgotten by time. "What do we do?" Thomas asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The figure's smile faded, and it stepped closer, its presence growing more solid with each passing second. "You must leave this place. The walls will not let you go. But the lullaby will guide you. Follow its song, and it will lead you to the truth." And then, as quickly as it had appeared, the figure vanished, leaving behind only the sound of the lullaby, which was now growing fainter, as though retreating into the shadows. The children stood in stunned silence, unable to process what they had just witnessed. The room, once filled with tension, now felt empty, hollow. They didn't know what to think, what to believe. The figure's words echoed in their minds. The truth is hidden in the lullaby. But what truth? And where could they find it? As they left the room, the door creaking shut behind them, they realized one thing. They had crossed a line. They could no longer turn back. The lullaby had chosen them, and they were now a part of the orphanage's dark, twisted history. What lay ahead they could not say. But one thing was certain. The truth was closer than ever, hidden beneath layers of forgotten memories, waiting to be uncovered. And whatever it was bound to change everything. The children couldn't shake the image of the ghostly figure, the child with eyes that saw too much. Its words echoed in their minds as they lay in their beds, the lullaby still faintly ringing in their ears. They had learned something important in the hidden room. The lullaby, the words on the walls, the children who had been lost in the orphanage's twisted history. They were all part of a greater mystery, one that seemed to spiral deeper with every discovery. But the more they uncovered, the more questions they had. Lily, Thomas, and Emma had always felt that the orphanage was strange, but they had no idea how deep the dark roots of the place ran. It was as if the building itself had grown from the pain and sorrow of the children who had lived there, sorrow that had never been allowed to rest. The figure had told them to follow the lullaby, to let it guide them toward the truth. But what did that truly mean? Could they trust the whispers in the dark? They hadn't been able to find answers in the basement or in the hidden room, but they knew they had to try again. Their curiosity burned hotter now, driving them forward. The orphanage was more than just a place of abandonment. It was a riddle, one whose pieces were scattered throughout the halls. And perhaps, just perhaps, the key to understanding it all lay in the most unexpected of places, the silence. The following morning, the children gathered again, the weight of the previous night's events still pressing on their hearts. The orphanage felt different now, its walls pulsing with an unspoken tension, as if the entire building was aware of their search. But they couldn't turn back. They had crossed a line when they'd followed the lullaby, and now they were bound to its rhythm. It was as if they were tethered to the haunting tune, drawn by its haunting call. Lily led the group to the attic, the one place they hadn't yet explored. It was an area of the orphanage that had always been off limits, not because it was dangerous, but because it was thought to be filled with nothing of interest. The adults had long forgotten about it, treating it as little more than a storage space. But to the children, it felt like a place where secrets could be found. The attic was dusty and cold, filled with old furniture, broken toys, and forgotten remnants of the orphanage's past. But what caught their attention was a large wooden chest at the far corner, its surface covered in dust and cobwebs. There was something about the chest that felt different. It was as if it had been waiting for them, patiently, for years. The moment they laid eyes on it, they knew it was important. Perhaps this chest held the answers they were searching for. Lily approached it first, her hand trembling as she brushed away the dust. The chest was locked, but the key was nowhere in sight. They had no idea how it had been secured or who might have locked it away, but they knew they couldn't leave without finding out what was inside. The key to the chest, like the key to the orphanage's mysteries, seemed to be hidden in plain sight. It was as though the orphanage itself was playing a game, teasing them with its secrets. Emma, always the practical one, knelt down and inspected the chest carefully. "There has to be something here," she muttered under her breath, running her hands along the edges. She tapped lightly on the wood, and to her surprise, a faint sound came from the inside, a soft, hollow thud. Her heart skipped a beat. Whatever was inside the chest, it wasn't just a pile of forgotten trinkets. There was something living in there, something that had been trapped away for far too long. Thomas looked at Emma, his face pale. "What was that? Did you hear it too?" "I heard it," she whispered. "It's alive." Lily's breath caught in her throat. "What do we do?" For a moment, there was silence, the kind of silence that pressed down on them like a heavy weight, suffocating and unnerving. But then, as if on cue, the chest's lid creaked open. The children jumped back, their hearts racing. The attic was bathed in a strange, ethereal light, and from inside the chest, a figure emerged, just as pale and translucent as the one they had seen before. But this figure was different. Its eyes were not the empty, hollow eyes of the previous child. They were full of pain, full of anguish, as if they had witnessed unspeakable horrors. It reached toward the children, its hands trembling, its form flickering in and out of existence, as if it were not entirely part of this world. The lullaby began to play again, but this time, the tune was distorted, broken, as if something was interfering with its melody. "You have come," the figure whispered, its voice a mournful echo. "You have come to listen." Lily took a step forward, her voice shaky. "Listen to what?" The figure's eyes locked onto hers, and for the first time, it spoke clearly. "To the silence that haunts this place. The silence of the forgotten. The silence of those who were never allowed to speak their truth. They have been silenced for so long, and now it is time for them to be heard." The words sent a chill down Lily's spine, and she couldn't breathe for a moment. The orphanage wasn't just haunted by ghosts, it was haunted by silence itself. The silence of all the children who had been ignored, forgotten, and erased from history. The lullaby was not just a song. It was a vessel for those children's voices, a way to call out to the living, to awaken the truth that had been buried for so long. "You must listen," the figure repeated. "The silence is the key to everything." The children stood in stunned silence, unsure of what to do next. The figure, now fading away, left them with one last message. "The key is in the silence, and you must find it before it is too late." And with that, the figure vanished, leaving behind only the lingering notes of the broken lullaby and the echo of its chilling warning. The children were left in the attic, the heavy weight of the silence settling over them like a shroud. They had learned something crucial, something that would change everything they thought they knew about the orphanage and about themselves. The silence wasn't just the absence of sound. It was the space where the truth had been hidden. And the more they listened, the more they realized that the silence was the most dangerous thing of all. The children sat in the attic for what seemed like hours, the strange figure's words hanging in the air like a suffocating fog. The silence, which had once felt like a refuge, now felt oppressive, suffused with secrets and buried memories. It was no longer just a quiet space. Each empty moment seemed to reverberate with the unresolved pain of the past, a pain they had yet to understand, but which had clearly been waiting for them. The silence was a thread they were now tied to, a thread that was pulling them deeper into a mystery that seemed to stretch back to the very foundation of the orphanage itself. Lily, Thomas, and Emma exchanged uncertain glances. They had hoped that unlocking the chest would bring clarity, but instead, it had only deepened the mystery. What was the meaning of the figure's warning? What silence had they yet to hear? They had known for some time that the orphanage was a place of discomfort, but they had never realized the depth of its darkness. Now, the pieces of the puzzle were scattered across the rooms and corridors, and it seemed as though they had only begun to scratch the surface. The attic, once a forgotten space filled with dust and debris, now felt like the center of the orphanage's secrets. Its walls were soaked in history, in the lives of children who had come and gone without leaving a trace. But the presence of the figure, the way it had appeared from the chest, made it clear. These children's stories had never truly ended. They lingered here, in the attic, in the silence, waiting for someone to listen. Thomas, always the skeptic, stood up, rubbing his face in frustration. "I don't understand. What does silence even mean in all of this? And why did that thing tell us to find it?" Emma, more introspective, stood by the window, her eyes scanning the view outside. "I think it's not just the physical silence," she said slowly, as though testing the weight of her words. "I think it's the silence of the children who were forgotten, those whose voices were never heard. The ones who died here, and no one ever spoke their names." Lily looked out the same window, her brow furrowed. Emma's words resonated with her in a way she couldn't explain. It was as if they had all been living in a bubble, unaware of the true story behind the orphanage. The silence wasn't just about empty rooms or still halls. It was the silence that had surrounded the tragic events of the past, events that no one had dared to speak of. The orphanage had become a monument to those forgotten lives, to children who had never found their place in the world. The truth was, none of them had ever been taught the full history of the place. The orphanage had been there for as long as they could remember, and it had always seemed like a place for children to grow up and move on. But what if it wasn't just a place of refuge? What if it was a place where the voices of those who had passed through its doors had been silenced, erased from the pages of time? What if those voices still lingered, desperate to be heard? As the day wore on, the children decided to explore the orphanage once more. They had to go beyond the attic, beyond the basement, to seek out the missing pieces of the story. The silence was too heavy, too suffocating to ignore. They needed to understand what had happened here, to give a voice to the children whose lives had been taken from them. Lily led the way down the creaky staircase, the silence of the halls growing louder with each step. They passed room after room, each one feeling like a tomb, each one holding the remnants of lives that had been abandoned. But one door caught their attention, a door they had never noticed before. It was tucked away in a corner, far from the main hall, as though it had always been hiding. There was no name on the door, no number, just a faded wooden surface that seemed older than the rest of the building. The children hesitated before approaching it, their hearts pounding in their chests. "What do you think is in there?" Thomas asked, his voice barely a whisper. Lily didn't answer immediately. She only reached out to turn the handle. The door creaked open, revealing a small room, dimly lit by the fading light from the hallway. Inside, the room was empty, save for a large wooden chest in the center. The air in the room felt thick, as though it had been sealed off for years. The chest was different from the one in the attic. It was smaller, more delicate, and it had intricate carvings along its surface. The children crowded around it, knowing that they had found something important. They had no idea what was inside, but they couldn't leave without opening it. Lily placed her hands on the chest, feeling the coolness of the wood against her palms. There was a weight to it, both literal and metaphorical, as if it was holding something more than just objects. She could almost feel the presence of the past pressing down on her, urging her to open it. With a deep breath, she unlocked the chest, and as the lid creaked open, the room seemed to hold its breath. Inside, there were papers, old, yellow documents, some torn and brittle with age. But there was something else too, something more disturbing, a small, tattered journal, its cover stained and worn. The children exchanged glances. This was it, the piece of the puzzle they had been searching for. But they didn't know how much it would change everything. Lily picked up the journal carefully, her fingers trembling as she opened it. The handwriting was faded but legible, and the first entry was dated many years ago, long before they had ever arrived at the orphanage. As she began to read aloud, the words sent a chill down her spine. The children of this place have been forgotten. Their voices are locked away, sealed in the silence of these walls. No one will remember us, but we will never be gone. The truth is buried here, and it must be found. The words struck a chord deep within them. The silence, the forgotten children, it was all connected. The mystery they were facing was not just about ghosts or spirits. It was about a history that had been deliberately erased, and the consequences of that erasure. As Lily read further, she realized the journal was a message from one of the children who had been lost to the orphanage's dark past. The silence had been their prison, and now it was calling out to be broken. The children closed the journal with a heavy heart. They had uncovered a piece of the story, but it was clear now that they were only beginning to understand the full scope of the horror that had unfolded in this place. And as they stood there, in the room with the chest, they realized something crucial. The silence they had been warned about wasn't just the absence of sound. It was the absence of memory, of truth. The more they uncovered, the more they would have to confront the darkness that had been hidden away for so long. The past wasn't dead. It was very much alive, and it was waiting for them to listen. The discovery of the journal had irrevocably altered the children's perception of the orphanage. What had once seemed like a simple, though eerie, place of shelter was now imbued with a profound sense of tragedy and secrecy. The room with the chest was only the beginning of what they now understood to be a long-forgotten history. Every corridor, every creaking floorboard, seemed to hold the potential for more revelations. But with each new piece of information they uncovered, they were drawn deeper into a world they were never meant to know. It was a world where silence was not just an absence of sound, but a deliberate erasure of voices that had once lived and breathed within these walls. The journal's message, with its chilling warning about forgotten children and silenced truths, had sent a ripple through their hearts. The words of the journal were clear. The silence in the orphanage was not only a result of time and neglect, it was a carefully cultivated silence, one that had been nurtured for reasons they could not yet fully understand. The more the children delved into the history of the orphanage, the more they began to understand that their search for answers was not simply about uncovering secrets. It was about giving a voice to the lost souls whose stories had been buried in the past. Lily, Thomas, and Emma found themselves drawn to the building's architecture in ways they hadn't before. The walls, which had once seemed like a mundane part of their environment, now seemed to whisper with the weight of untold stories. They began to notice things they hadn't seen before: small cracks in the walls, warped floors, and peculiar stains that seemed to have no clear origin. The orphanage, once a collection of rooms and hallways, now felt like a living entity, its history etched into every surface. The children realized that the walls themselves were witnesses to the trauma that had occurred within the orphanage's long, storied existence. At night, when the orphanage was bathed in darkness, they could hear faint sounds, creaks, whispers, and the occasional shuffling of feet. At first, they thought it was just the house settling, the wind moving through the rafters. But soon, they began to question whether the sounds were truly natural. They were not random. They seemed deliberate, as though someone or something was trying to communicate with them from behind the walls. It was a disorienting experience, especially for Thomas, who had always been the most rational of the group. He was quick to dismiss the sounds as figments of their imaginations, but even he couldn't ignore the strange feeling that something was shifting within the walls of the orphanage, something that was eager to be heard. One evening, as the children gathered in the hallway near the attic, they heard it again. This time, the sound was louder, more distinct, a faint scratching noise, followed by what sounded like muffled voices. It was coming from the walls themselves, as though the very structure of the orphanage was alive with the whispers of the past. Emma, who had been the most sensitive to the atmosphere of the place, felt a chill run down her spine. "Do you hear that?" she whispered, her voice trembling with a mixture of fear and curiosity. Lily and Thomas nodded in agreement, their eyes wide. They stood frozen, listening intently as the scratching grew louder. It was as if the walls were alive with movement, as though someone was trying to break free. The voices, though muffled, were unmistakable. They spoke in a language the children couldn't understand, but the tone was unmistakable, frantic, desperate, and filled with an unspoken urgency. "Where is it coming from?" Thomas whispered, his voice barely audible over the noise. The children followed the sound, moving cautiously down the hallway, their hearts racing. The noise seemed to come from the walls of a room they hadn't noticed before, an old storage room at the far end of the hall. It was a room they had never been inside, one that was always locked. They stood before the door, their breath held in anticipation. The scratching noise was louder now, almost deafening, and the voices were becoming more distinct, though still unintelligible. They knew they had to open the door, but none of them dared to turn the handle. What if whatever was on the other side was worse than they imagined? Finally, Lily took a deep breath and reached for the door. The cold metal of the doorknob sent a shock through her body, but she forced herself to twist it, the door creaking open with an eerie groan. The room beyond was dimly lit by the faint glow of a single light bulb that hung from the ceiling. Dust hung in the air like smoke, and old furniture was piled haphazardly against the walls. But it was the walls themselves that drew the children's attention. The scratching sounds were louder than ever, emanating from behind one of the walls. There was no visible source for the noise, no rodent, no insect, nothing that could explain the disturbance. But the children felt certain that the source of the sound was just on the other side of the plaster. The whispers, too, were more intense now, almost as if the voices were growing agitated, pleading for attention. What do we do? Emma asked, her voice cracking with fear. Lily hesitated, her mind racing. We need to open the wall, she said, her voice firm despite the fear that gripped her. There's something in there, something we need to see. We have to know what's causing this. The three children began to search the room for anything that could help them break through the wall. They found a rusty crowbar tucked beneath an old wooden crate, its metal surface dull from years of disuse. With trembling hands, Lily gripped the crowbar, and the children set to work, prying away the layers of plaster and wood. The scratching from behind the wall grew louder as they worked, almost as if it were urging them on. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, they broke through. The hole in the wall revealed a small, hidden space, barely large enough to fit a person. But what they saw within it was enough to freeze their blood. A series of old, yellowed papers, handwritten in a language none of them recognized, were strewn across the floor. They looked like a diary, but the handwriting was erratic and frantic. It was clear that someone had written in a desperate attempt to communicate. And there, at the center of the space, was a small, cracked mirror. The reflection in the mirror was distorted, as though it was reflecting not the present, but something from the past, a figure, pale and gaunt, standing just behind them. The room fell silent. The whispers ceased. The scratching stopped, and for a moment, the children could do nothing but stare at the mirror, horrified by the glimpse of something they could not understand. They had uncovered something they were never meant to see, but in doing so, they had opened a door that could never be closed. Whatever had been hidden in the walls was now awake, and it was watching them. The discovery in the wall had left the children stunned, their minds reeling from what they had just uncovered. The diary's cryptic language and the strange mirror had not only revealed a disturbing history, but had also deepened the mystery surrounding the orphanage. But it wasn't just the physical objects they had found. It was the feeling of something watching them, something ancient and aware, lurking just beyond the veil of the ordinary. The mirror, with its warped reflection, had unsettled them in ways they couldn't fully explain. It felt as if they had touched something that should have remained untouched, a memory or a curse tied to the very foundation of the orphanage. In the days that followed, the children couldn't shake the feeling of being followed. It wasn't just the eerie whispers in the walls or the strange occurrences that seemed to haunt them. It was something more subtle, something that gnawed at the edges of their consciousness. At night, when they lay in their beds, the shadows seemed to grow longer, creeping along the walls as though they were alive. They would wake up in the middle of the night, certain that they had heard footsteps in the hall, or worse, whispers, faint and unintelligible, that seemed to come from the very walls themselves. The more they tried to ignore it, the stronger the feeling became. It was as if the orphanage was holding its breath, waiting for something or someone to make the next move. They began to wonder if they had disturbed something that should have been left alone. The children who had lived here, the ones whose stories were hidden within the walls, were no longer just figments of the past. They had become something more. They were voices in the dark, trapped in a forgotten space between time and memory. It was Emma who first began to understand the significance of the mirror. She had spent hours staring at it, trying to make sense of the distorted reflection, when something strange happened. One night, as she gazed into the glass, she thought she saw a figure standing behind her. But when she turned around, no one was there. It wasn't the first time something like this had happened. The mirror, she realized, didn't just reflect the present. It seemed to reflect something else, something hidden just beyond the surface of reality. She couldn't shake the feeling that the mirror was showing her glimpses of something from the past, something trapped within the walls of the orphanage. Thomas, ever the skeptic, dismissed Emma's concerns. But even he couldn't deny the unsettling atmosphere that seemed to hang over the orphanage like a heavy fog. He had been hearing the whispers too, faint and eerie, as if they were coming from the walls themselves. And the scratching sounds, the relentless, maddening scratching that echoed through the corridors, had only grown louder. It was as if something was trying to break free from the darkness, desperate to be heard. Lily, who had been the most hesitant about their investigation, began to feel the weight of what they had uncovered. The diary, the mirror, and the whispers They were all connected, and somehow they were at the center of it. The orphanage had once been a sanctuary, a place for children in need, but now it felt more like a prison, a place where the past had been buried too deeply to stay hidden. The children in the walls were no longer just memories. They were echoes of a past that refused to remain silent. And whatever force had kept them hidden for so long was now awake, stirring with an unnatural energy. One evening, as the children gathered in the attic to examine the journal further, they were interrupted by a soft, almost imperceptible sound, a faint tapping coming from the far corner of the room. At first, they thought it was just the wind or perhaps a rodent moving in the walls. But when the tapping grew louder, they couldn't ignore it any longer. It wasn't the sound of something natural. It was rhythmic, deliberate, like the sound of someone or something trying to communicate. The children exchanged nervous glances, wondering if it was a continuation of the strange occurrences they had been experiencing. Lily, despite her growing fear, was the first to approach the corner where the tapping seemed to originate. There, in the dim light, she could see nothing out of the ordinary. No rodent, no object, no sign of the source of the sound. Yet the tapping continued, more insistent now. It was as if whatever was in the walls was growing desperate, trying to break through. In a moment of impulsive determination, Lily reached out and touched the wall, pressing her hand against the cold surface. The moment her hand made contact, the tapping ceased. For a split second, everything was quiet, as if the orphanage itself had stopped breathing. But then something else happened. The wall, where her hand had touched, began to ripple, like the surface of water disturbed by a stone. A low, groaning sound emanated from within the walls, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop. The children stepped back in shock, their hearts pounding in their chests. "What's happening?" Emma whispered, her voice barely audible. Lily, still reeling from the strange sensation, took a step back and looked at the others. "I don't know, but I think we've awakened something." In the following days, the children tried to make sense of what they had experienced. They could no longer ignore the strange occurrences that seemed to follow them everywhere. The whispers in the walls, the tapping, the unnerving feeling that something was waiting for them just beyond the threshold of the orphanage. It was as if the building itself was alive, breathing in sync with their fear. The orphanage had once been a place of refuge, but now it was a place of shadows and forgotten memories. The children, whose voices had been silenced for so long, were now more than just echoes. They were a presence, a force that could not be ignored. The mirror, the journal, the whispers, they were all part of something far more sinister than they had ever imagined. And as they continued to search for answers, the children realized that they were no longer just investigating the history of the orphanage. They were becoming part of it. Their fates were now intertwined with the forgotten children of the orphanage, and whatever had been sealed away for so long was now on the verge of being unleashed. The walls of the orphanage had always been meant to contain the past, but now the past was breaking through, and there was no turning back. The children knew they had crossed a threshold, one that had once been carefully guarded by silence and secrecy. They had unlocked something that had been buried deep within the orphanage's walls, a force that had remained dormant for decades. Yet, with each passing day, the weight of their discovery grew heavier, and the boundaries between the past and the present seemed to blur. The whispers had intensified, and the sense of being watched became overwhelming, as though the orphanage itself was alive, its history pressing in on them from every direction. They tried to go about their daily routines, but it was impossible to ignore the sensation of eyes on them. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind, every shadow seemed to hold the promise of something lurking just out of sight. At night, when they lay in their beds, it felt as though the air itself was charged with an unspoken threat. The orphanage had once been a sanctuary, but now it felt more like a prison, a place where the walls themselves held secrets that no one was meant to uncover. Emma, still grappling with the unsettling image of the mirror, had become increasingly withdrawn. She had spent hours each day staring into its depths, hoping to find some clue that would make sense of the disturbing images she had seen. But every time she looked, the reflection seemed to change, becoming more distorted and alien. The figure she had seen behind her on that first night had begun to take on a more familiar shape, a face she recognized but could not place. She had tried to tell the others, but no one seemed to understand the depth of her unease. The mirror was more than just a reflection. It was a window into something far darker. Thomas, ever the skeptic, had begun to lose his resolve. He could no longer dismiss the strange occurrences as mere coincidence. The tapping in the walls, the whispers, the eerie silence that descended upon them whenever they found themselves alone. It was all too much. And yet, every time they tried to confront it head-on, the mystery deepened. It was as though the orphanage was playing a game with them, drawing them further into its web with each passing day. There was no escape, no place where they could hide from the shadows that seemed to follow them wherever they went. Lily, who had always been the most cautious of the group, had begun to unravel. She had once been the first to try and explain away the odd occurrences, but now she found herself questioning everything. The sense of being trapped, not just in the orphanage, but in the very fabric of the past, had become suffocating. Every day felt like a step closer to some inevitable conclusion, one that they could not avoid. She had started to notice things that she couldn't explain, a figure standing at the edge of her vision, only to vanish when she turned her head, a faint, almost imperceptible scratching at the windows, like the sound of something trying to break in. It was as though the orphanage had become a living, breathing entity, and the children were its prisoners. The others had begun to notice the changes in Lily. She was growing thinner, her eyes hollow with exhaustion. It was as if she had been drained by the very air in the orphanage. And yet, despite the growing terror, there was a part of her that was drawn to the mystery, a part that could not let go of the feeling that they were on the verge of uncovering something truly extraordinary. But each new revelation seemed only to pull them deeper into the darkness, and the fear was beginning to take its toll on them all. One evening, as the children gathered in the attic once again to discuss their findings, the atmosphere was thicker than ever. The air was heavy with tension, and the shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally along the walls. As they pored over the journal once more, Emma suddenly froze, her gaze fixed on a particular entry. Her fingers trembled as she traced the words, as though she had seen them before, somewhere in the recesses of her mind. It was an entry that seemed almost out of place, a cryptic passage that spoke of the children of the glass. It mentioned an ancient ritual, one that involved the binding of souls to the orphanage itself, trapping them in the space between life and death. The others leaned in, reading the passage over her shoulder, their faces pale with apprehension. "The children of the glass," Thomas muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. "What does that mean?" Lily shook her head, her heart racing. "I don't know, but it sounds like it's talking about the children who lived here. Maybe the ones whose spirits are still trapped in this place." Her voice trembled with fear, the gravity of the situation beginning to sink in. Emma, still staring at the journal, felt a wave of nausea wash over her. She had seen the name of one of the children mentioned in the diary before, the same face she had seen in the mirror. A child who had vanished years ago, whose disappearance had never been fully explained. The connection was undeniable. The mirror wasn't just showing reflections. It was showing the children who had been lost, their souls bound to the orphanage, unable to find peace. Thomas stepped back, his mind racing. But why are they still here? Why are we seeing them now? The answer came slowly, almost unwillingly. It wasn't just the orphanage that had kept them trapped. It was the mirror, the journal, the very fabric of the building itself. They had disturbed something ancient, something that had been buried for so long that it had become an entity in and of itself. The children of the glass were not just spirits. They were the remnants of something much older, something that had once been part of the orphanage's dark history. And now, their presence was bleeding into the present, breaking through the walls that had once kept them contained. Lily could feel her heart pounding in her chest as the weight of the revelation settled over them. The orphanage was no longer just a place of mystery. It was a place of death, a place where the past and the present had become intertwined in a way that defied logic. The children they had uncovered were not merely echoes. They were the essence of the orphanage itself, and their voices had been waiting for someone to listen. Now that they had found the journal, the mirror, and the hidden truth, there was no turning back. They were no longer just investigating the history of the orphanage. They were part of it. They had awakened the past, and whatever force had been holding it back was now free to make its presence known. The orphanage was alive, and it was watching. And with that realization, the children understood that they were no longer safe. They had crossed the line, and the walls were closing in around them. Whatever had been set in motion could not be undone. The realization that the orphanage was alive, that the past was no longer a distant memory, but an active force shaping the present, changed everything. No longer could the children dismiss the strange occurrences as mere coincidence. The atmosphere in the orphanage had become suffocating, thick with the weight of unspoken secrets. It wasn't just the physical structure they were dealing with. It was something far deeper, an ancient, malevolent presence that had been waiting for its moment to resurface. The mirror, the journal, the cryptic whispers. They were all pieces of a puzzle that none of them had been prepared to solve. Emma, once so determined to uncover the truth, now felt a gnawing sense of dread every time she entered the orphanage's halls. The fear had taken root in her, growing with each passing hour. She had spent countless nights staring into the mirror, hoping to make sense of the visions. But now it felt like the mirror had become a gateway, a connection to something darker. The faces of the lost children no longer appeared fleeting and distant. They were becoming more vivid, more defined. They were watching her, reaching for her. The glass had become a portal, but not one she could control. Lily had begun to exhibit signs of deep distress. The fear that had once seemed like an abstract feeling had now become an overwhelming presence in her life. She had begun to lose sleep, waking up in the middle of the night to hear the soft, sinister whispers that seemed to come from nowhere. Her once steady hands now trembled, and her face was pale, marked by the sleepless nights and the gnawing fear that clung to her. It was as if something was slowly draining her life force, pulling her deeper into the very nightmare they had uncovered. The worst part was that Lily could feel the walls closing in, but no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't escape. The orphanage had become a labyrinth, its corridors shifting in ways that defied logic. Thomas, ever the skeptic, had been the first to try and rationalize the changes they were experiencing. He had always prided himself on his ability to remain calm, to think logically in the face of fear. But even he couldn't deny that something was terribly wrong. The orphanage was no longer just a building. It had become a living entity, one that was actively watching and manipulating them. The coldness of the rooms seemed to seep into their bones, and no matter where they went, the feeling of being followed was inescapable. Thomas had begun to sense an unseen presence, something that wasn't confined to the walls, but hovered just out of sight, waiting for its moment. As the days dragged on, they all began to notice the patterns in the odd occurrences. It wasn't random. There was a rhythm to it, a method to the madness. The whispers would grow louder at night, only to fade during the day. The shadows would shift in the corners of their eyes, but when they looked directly, there would be nothing there. The orphanage itself seemed to pulse with an eerie energy, as if it were alive, breathing. It was as though the past had never truly left. It had merely lain dormant, waiting for the right time to awaken. And now, that time had come. One evening, while the children gathered in the attic to discuss their next course of action, the air grew unnaturally still. The temperature dropped sharply, and they could feel it, the weight of the silence pressing down on them. They had been discussing the next steps in their investigation when Emma suddenly froze, her eyes wide in terror. She had seen something so horrifying that it rendered her speechless. For a moment, no one could speak, the only sound the pounding of their own hearts. But then Emma, her voice barely a whisper, spoke the words that none of them wanted to hear. "The mirror. It's changing." The others turned to her, but Emma's gaze was fixed on something unseen, her face drawn tight with fear. They followed her line of sight to the mirror in the corner of the attic, but there was nothing there, nothing that they could see. Emma, however, was trembling, her breath coming in shallow gasps. "It's showing something, someone, it's showing me." They all gathered around the mirror, their eyes darting nervously. The reflection in the glass had shifted, but not in the way they had expected. It wasn't just showing the empty room behind them. No, this time, the mirror reflected something darker, something much more sinister. Emma saw herself, but not as she was now. The figure in the glass was distorted, twisted, her face contorted in a grotesque smile. The room behind her was no longer the attic, but a place she didn't recognize, a dark, crumbling hallway that seemed to stretch on forever. Thomas stepped forward, trying to rationalize the situation. "It's just a trick of the light, Emma. You're seeing things." But as soon as the words left his mouth, the temperature in the room dropped even further, and a low hum began to fill the air. The mirror was alive, and it was responding to their presence. Lily, who had been standing behind them, let out a soft cry of terror. "No, it's not just the mirror. It's everything. We're being drawn into it. Can't you see? This place isn't just haunted. It's something worse. It's controlling us." The realization hit them all at once. The orphanage was no longer a place they could escape. They had become part of its history, part of its legacy. The children of the glass were not just spirits bound to the orphanage. They were a manifestation of the place itself, and the orphanage had chosen them. They were not just investigating the past. They had become entangled in it. And whatever force was at work, it wasn't just haunting them. It was feeding on them, drawing them deeper into its grasp with each passing day. With this new understanding came a crushing sense of inevitability. The orphanage was more than just a haunted building. It was a sentient, malevolent force that had been waiting for them. And now that they had uncovered the truth, there was no going back. The children had become pawns in a game that had been set in motion long before they had arrived. The echoes of the past were no longer distant whispers. They were calling to them, and the walls were closing in. The orphanage had claimed them, and they were trapped within its ever-tightening grip. As they stood in front of the mirror, staring at their distorted reflections, the only thought that ran through their minds was that they were no longer just visitors to the orphanage. They had become part of its story, and there was no way out. As the days wore on, the atmosphere in the orphanage grew thicker, more oppressive. The presence that had made itself known was no longer a subtle, creeping sensation. It was a constant, suffocating force. Every room seemed to be filled with a heavy air, as though it were waiting, watching, and the children could feel it every time they moved through the halls. Their senses were heightened, their nerves frayed from the constant sense of unease. The orphanage, once a seemingly quiet and abandoned place, had become a living, breathing entity, a creature of the past that refused to stay buried. It was in the dead of night that the orphanage revealed its true nature. The walls, which had once seemed so solid and unyielding, now seemed to hum with a faint energy. Emma, the most determined among them, could no longer deny the deep connection between the building and the paranormal occurrences. She had spent countless hours researching the history of the orphanage, hoping to find something, anything that would explain the horror they were living through. What she discovered, however, was far more disturbing than she had anticipated. The orphanage had once been a refuge for orphan children, but not all of them had been taken in with kindness. The history of the orphanage was steeped in tragedy. Stories of mistreatment, neglect, and abuse had been buried beneath the surface. But there was one story, one that stood out above the rest. A child, no older than 10, had disappeared without a trace many years ago. The child had been known for his strange behavior, whispering to imaginary friends, speaking of things no one could understand. The records indicated that the child had become increasingly agitated, exhibiting strange and violent tendencies. Then one night he vanished. The staff at the orphanage had been unable to explain his disappearance, and the mystery remained unsolved. That child, Emma realized, was the key to understanding what was happening now. Emma shared her findings with the others, but her revelation only deepened the sense of dread that had settled over them all. It seemed as though the orphanage had become a prison, a place where the suffering of the past had festered and taken root. And now, it was not just the ghostly echoes of the children who had once lived there that haunted the halls. The very foundation of the orphanage seemed to hold the lingering remnants of pain and sorrow, emotions that had become twisted and malignant over time. The building itself had absorbed these dark feelings, and now it was feeding on the new generation of children. Lily, who had always been sensitive to the supernatural, felt the change most acutely. Her nights were filled with restless dreams, nightmares in which she wandered the darkened halls of the orphanage, calling out for someone, anyone, to help her. But no one ever answered. The walls themselves seemed to close in on her, and the whispers from the past grew louder, more insistent. She began to hear the voice of the child who had disappeared all those years ago. It was a faint, distant sound at first, but it grew clearer over time. The voice called to her, beckoning her towards something, though she was unsure of what it was. She could feel the pull, the magnetic draw of the child's voice, and it filled her with a sense of dread that she could not shake. Thomas, though skeptical, could no longer deny the strange things happening around him. He had always prided himself on his ability to think logically, to maintain a sense of control even in the face of fear. But now, even he found it difficult to escape the growing sense of malevolent energy that pervaded the orphanage. The shadows seemed to have a life of their own, creeping along the walls and shifting when no one was looking. The temperature in the rooms fluctuated wildly, from stifling heat to biting cold, with no explanation. And the whispers, always the whispers, echoed in his ears, growing louder each day. It was as if the very fabric of reality was being torn apart, and he couldn't keep it together anymore. One night, as they gathered in the library to share their findings and discuss their next steps, the room seemed to darken before their eyes. The flickering candlelight cast long, stretching shadows that seemed to move of their own accord. Emma, Lily, and Thomas all turned as one toward the door, which had opened slowly, almost as though it had been drawn by an invisible hand. The air was thick with tension, and a strange chill filled the room. They waited, their breaths held in anticipation, unsure of what would happen next. And then it came, a voice, not from any of them, but from somewhere deeper within the walls, came a low, guttural whisper. The words were not entirely clear, but the meaning was unmistakable. "You will never leave." The words hung in the air, their weight unbearable. The children looked at each other, their faces pale with fear. They could no longer deny it. The orphanage was alive, and it was not willing to let them go. The past, with all its pain and suffering, had a hold on them, and there was no escaping its grip. They had become part of the orphanage's story, and the only way out was to unravel the mystery of the child who had disappeared all those years ago. Emma, the ever-determined leader, took a deep breath and made a decision. They had to find out what had happened to the child. They had to uncover the truth behind the disappearance, no matter the cost. It was the only way to break the cycle, to free themselves from the cursed grip of the orphanage. The key to their survival lay in the forgotten past, and they had no choice but to face it head-on. But as they made their way through the darkened halls, they couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, that the orphanage itself was keeping track of their every movement. The walls seemed to close in on them, and the whispers grew louder. And somewhere in the distance, they could hear it again, the faint, eerie sound of the child's voice calling them deeper into the darkness. There was no turning back now. The orphanage had claimed them, and they were about to discover just how far its reach extended. The search for answers had become an obsession. For Emma and the others, the chilling discovery that the orphanage itself seemed to be alive with malevolent force was a terrifying realization. Every room they entered now felt like an extension of the entity that haunted them. The once familiar corridors, hallways, and dormitories of the orphanage now felt like a twisted maze, where the walls whispered secrets they were not yet ready to understand. As the days passed, the sense of urgency deepened. Each whisper, each flicker of movement in the shadows, was a reminder that time was running out. The orphanage had become a prison, and every step they took brought them closer to a truth they could no longer ignore. In their most desperate moments, the children sought out new clues, combing through the abandoned rooms and long-forgotten corners of the building. It was during one of these explorations that Lily, ever sensitive to the unexplainable, noticed something peculiar in the library's floor. There was a small, uneven patch of wood, almost as if it had been hastily repaired. She couldn't shake the feeling that it hid something far darker than a simple imperfection. Despite the strange sense of unease that filled the air, she reached down and pressed her fingers to the boards. A low creak followed, the floorboards shifting slightly beneath her touch. "Look," Lily whispered, motioning for Emma and Thomas to come closer. Emma, ever the leader, knelt down beside her, examining the spot where the floor seemed disturbed. "It's not just a repair," she observed, her voice filled with a mix of fear and intrigue. "Something's been hidden here. Something recent." Thomas stood back, his eyes scanning the room nervously. "We should be careful," he warned, but Emma was already lifting up the loose boards with a determined hand. It was clear to them all that they couldn't stop now, not when they were so close to unearthing the truth. Slowly, they pried the boards free, revealing a dark, hollow space beneath. Dust and dirt had settled in the crevices, and at first, it appeared to be empty. But as the light from their candles flickered, something glimmered, a faint metallic gleam, like an old key or a piece of jewelry. Emma carefully reached into the hollow and pulled out an object wrapped in tattered cloth. As she unwrapped it, the object revealed itself to be an old, rusted key, its surface worn smooth with age. It looked ordinary, yet there was something undeniably unsettling about it. Emma felt a chill run down her spine as she turned it over in her hand. "What is this for?" she asked aloud, though no one had the answer. The atmosphere in the room shifted. The whispers that had been so constant in the background now grew louder, and for the first time, the children could hear distinct words in the voices. The same voice from before, the one of the lost child, called to them, its words garbled and distorted. "Down below. Find me." The voice seemed to beckon, almost pleading. Emma's grip on the key tightened, her decision clear. "This is it," she said, her voice low and resolute. "We need to go below. It's the only way to understand what happened." They had to find the source of the voices, the child who had disappeared, and break whatever curse had been cast over the orphanage. As they ventured deeper into the bowels of the building, the air grew colder, thicker. The walls closed in, the space becoming tighter with each step. The whispers echoed in their ears, bouncing off the walls in a disorienting chorus. The ground beneath their feet seemed to shift, almost as though the very foundation of the orphanage was alive, pulsating with malevolent energy. The key seemed to burn in Emma's hand, its presence a constant reminder that they were approaching something far beyond their understanding. They descended further, winding their way through corridors that hadn't seen human footsteps in years. Each door they passed was either locked or blocked by rubble, as though the orphanage itself was trying to keep them from reaching the heart of its darkness. It was then that they stumbled upon a door that was different from the others, a wooden door at the far end of a forgotten hallway. It was old but not decayed. Its lock was intricate, as though it had been crafted with care, and the keyhole seemed to beckon them. Lily was the first to approach. She took a deep breath, holding the key in her trembling hand. The lock turned with an unsettling ease, as though it had been waiting for years to be unlocked. As the door creaked open, a wave of oppressive energy washed over them, like a pressure pressing against their very souls. The room beyond was dark, and its air thick with decay. They stepped inside, their footsteps echoing in the silence. The room was unlike any other they had encountered in the orphanage. It was small, cramped, and the walls were covered in strange, faded symbols. There were remnants of old, worn furniture, beds, chairs, and tables scattered haphazardly across the floor. But the most disturbing thing about the room was the floor itself. The tiles were cracked and stained, and in the center of the room, there was a large hole, a dark abyss that seemed to stretch downward into infinity. Lily gasped. "What is this place?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "This is where it all began," Emma said softly, her eyes wide with horror. "This is the place where the child disappeared." The hole before them seemed to pulse with a dark energy, and the voices grew louder, more insistent. They could hear the child's voice again, clearer now. "Come down. Come find me." The words were no longer distorted. but filled with urgency. Without thinking, Emma took a step toward the hole. The key still clutched tightly in her hand. She approached the center of the room, and as she did, the floor beneath her feet began to shift and groan. A sudden realization hit her with a wave of terror. This place was not merely the site of a tragedy. It was the source of everything that had haunted them. The voices, the shadows, the whispers. Everything was connected to this dark, forgotten place beneath the orphanage. But before she could make another move, the ground beneath them shook violently, and the room seemed to come alive, as if reacting to their presence. The hole opened wider, and a gust of cold air rushed upward, carrying with it the unmistakable scent of decay. The child's voice, now a scream, echoed in their ears. And just as quickly, the room fell silent. For a long moment, they stood frozen, unsure of what to do next. The terror they had experienced over the past days seemed to culminate in that one overwhelming moment. The truth was undeniable now. The orphanage had been built upon something far darker than they had imagined, and it was reaching out, pulling them into its grasp. They had no choice but to confront it. The curse of the orphanage was not just tied to the building itself. It was bound to the child who had vanished, and now they had to go deeper. To find the child, to end the nightmare, they would have to descend into the very heart of the darkness. They had no idea what awaited them in the depths. But one thing was certain. They were about to uncover the truth behind the orphanage, a truth far more terrifying than any of them could have imagined. As Emma and the others stood in the room with the open hole, a deep sense of foreboding settled over them. The silence that followed the terrifying gust of cold air was deafening. The air in the room seemed to press in on them, and for a brief moment, it felt like time had stopped. Every instinct screamed at them to turn around, to run away from this madness. But the weight of their mission held them in place. They had come this far. The discovery of the key, the whispers, the child's voice. None of it could be ignored. It had all led them to this point. They had to go down. The room around them was dark and oppressive, its very atmosphere saturated with malevolent energy. The air was thick, heavy with dust and the scent of decay, as though the very walls were rotting from within. And then there was the hole itself, wide and deep, stretching into the unknown like the gaping maw of some great beast. It called to them, beckoning them to descend into its depths. The child's voice, now distorted and incomprehensible, echoed again, a low, guttural sound that vibrated through their bones. Emma, her heart racing, felt an icy hand grip her soul. The key in her hand seemed to hum with a dark power, its weight more oppressive now than ever. She hesitated for only a moment before she spoke, her voice shaking. "We have no choice. We need to go down." Her words hung in the air like a grim decree. The others nodded in agreement, their faces pale, their eyes wide with a mix of fear and resolve. There was no turning back. Lily, who had been standing at the edge of the hole, took a cautious step forward. The floor beneath her feet creaked ominously, as if warning her to stop. But she pressed on, peering into the darkness below. "Do you think the child is down there?" she asked quietly, though her voice trembled. The thought of confronting whatever malevolent force had taken the child, and perhaps many others, filled her with dread. "I don't know," Emma replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "But the voices, they've been guiding us. We need to follow them. We need to find the truth." The decision made, they began their descent. Each of them felt the gravity of the moment, the weight of their own fear, and the unknown pressing down upon them. Thomas, always the one to question, lingered near the back, his mind racing. "What if we're walking right into its trap?" he muttered to himself, though the others could hear the unease in his voice. It was a valid concern. The orphanage itself was a living entity, its malevolent presence a constant reminder of the dangers they faced. But they had already come too far, and the need for answers outweighed their fears. They carefully lowered themselves down the hole, each step a painful reminder of how deep the darkness went. The ladder, or what passed for one, was worn, its rungs slick with age and rot. The cold air intensified as they descended, the further they went. The whispers had become louder, more distinct. "Come closer," they seemed to beckon. The voice of the child, still garbled, was now accompanied by a chorus of other, distorted voices. Emma felt a shiver run down her spine, but she forced herself to keep moving. At last, they reached the bottom. The space was small and cramped, the walls surrounding them thick with dampness and mildew. The faint glow from their candles illuminated what appeared to be a long-forgotten cellar, a place where time itself had stopped. Dust lay thick on the ground, and the air was stagnant, heavy with the scent of decay and rot. Old, crumbling crates and boxes were stacked haphazardly along the walls, some of them open, revealing nothing but dust and shattered remnants of forgotten objects. But in the far corner of the room, there was something that caught their attention. An old wooden door, its frame warped with age. Lily was the first to approach the door. She reached out, her hand trembling, and turned the handle. The door creaked open with a sound that seemed to echo through the entire room. Beyond it lay a narrow passageway, its walls lined with more debris, more forgotten relics of a time long past. But as they stepped into the passage, the temperature dropped even further. It was as though the very air had become colder, denser, and the oppressive sense of dread that had followed them since they entered the orphanage only deepened. As they ventured further down the narrow corridor, they began to feel something more tangible, an unnatural force pressing down on them from all sides. The walls seemed to close in, and the whispers grew louder, more urgent. It was as if something or someone was watching them, waiting for them to reach the end of this path. Emma could feel the weight of the darkness growing, the fear clawing at her insides. They continued to move forward, driven by a single, overwhelming purpose. They had to find the child. They had to find out what had happened to this place, to uncover the horrible truth that had been hidden for so long. The further they walked, the more twisted the passage became. The walls seemed to warp and distort, bending in unnatural angles, as though the very structure of the building was shifting. Emma could hear the others breathing heavily behind her, their footsteps echoing in the narrow, suffocating space. At last, they reached the end of the corridor. The passage opened into a small, circular room, its walls lined with strange markings, symbols that Emma couldn't understand, but that seemed to pulsate with an ancient energy. In the center of the room, there was a large stone altar, its surface covered in a thick layer of dust and grime. It was old, far older than the orphanage itself. The child's voice was now a clear, desperate cry, louder than ever before. "Help me! Help me, please!" Without thinking, Emma rushed toward the altar, the others following closely behind her. She reached out to touch the surface of the stone, and in that instant, the ground beneath them shook violently. The walls of the room seemed to close in, and the whispers grew louder, more frantic. The child's voice echoed in her ears, but now it was no longer just a plea. It was a warning. Leave now. Leave before it's too late. But it was already too late. A crackling sound filled the air as the altar began to glow with an eerie, otherworldly light. The ground trembled beneath their feet, and the walls seemed to warp and twist as if the very fabric of reality was being unraveled. Emma could feel the darkness closing in, suffocating her, and in that moment, she realized the terrible truth. The orphanage wasn't just haunted, it was alive, a living, breathing entity that had been waiting for them to come. And now, there would be no escape. The room, now bathed in an unnatural, pulsating glow, seemed to warp around Emma and her companions, as if they were trapped within the very heartbeat of the building itself. The altar at the center of the room continued to radiate a blinding light, and the walls trembled with a force that made the floor beneath their feet feel unstable, as though the very foundation of the orphanage was buckling under some unseen pressure. The echoes of the child's desperate plea for help filled the air, but now they seemed distorted, no longer just a cry for mercy, but a chilling warning, a final cry before the inevitable. Emma's chest tightened with fear, the overwhelming presence of something ancient and malevolent pressing in on her. She turned to look at her friends, their faces pale, eyes wide with terror. But it was Thomas who spoke first, his voice quivering with the kind of dread that only the truly horrified know. "What have we done?" he whispered, more to himself than anyone else, as if realizing the magnitude of their actions too late. Lily, still standing next to Emma, clutched her arm. "We need to get out of here. This thing, whatever it is, it's alive. We've awoken it." Emma nodded, though her mind screamed in opposition. Her fingers brushed the edges of the key she still clutched in her hand, and for the briefest moment, it seemed to thrum with power, an almost sentient energy, alive in its own right. It was clear to her now. The key had not only led them here, but had awakened something far more sinister than they could have ever anticipated. The voices, the cries of the children, the whispers in the dark, had been only the beginning. The orphanage had been holding its breath, and now it was exhaling its horrors, all of them, in one final push. Thomas took a step back, his expression torn. "It's not too late to leave. We can still turn back. We can find another way." "No," Emma's voice cut through the air, sharp and resolute. "We can't leave now. Whatever this is, whatever we've unleashed, it's here because we came. And if we leave now, we'll be running from it, running from our own failure. We need to see this through." She didn't know where the strength came from, but in that moment, she felt a deep certainty, like a revelation that came from somewhere beyond reason. They had come this far, and they couldn't turn back, not when the truth was so close. The child's voice cried out again, but this time, it was different, faint but growing clearer. It was almost as if the child was trying to speak to them, to warn them, but Emma couldn't understand the words. She only knew that they had to follow it. The ground shook again, but this time, the tremor wasn't just from the altar's strange power. It was something else, something far deeper within the building, something far older. The walls of the room cracked, and from those cracks, tendrils of darkness began to slither out, creeping along the floor like serpents. The air turned cold, freezing, and the whispers in the darkness grew louder, now twisted into guttural, maddened voices that clawed at their minds. Emma's pulse quickened, and her breath came in shallow gasps. "It's too late," she thought to herself, but the thought was drowned out by the deepening hum of the altar, its energy pulsing in the air like a living creature. "I've seen this before," Thomas said suddenly, his voice filled with a strange clarity. Emma turned to look at him, her brow furrowing in confusion. He wasn't speaking to them directly, but his words still carried an eerie weight. In the old stories, the ones the caretakers used to tell the children, the ones that nobody believed, the ones about the living orphanage, Lily gasped. "What are you talking about?" "The orphanage isn't just a building," Thomas explained, his voice low and almost hypnotic. "It's a part of something ancient. I didn't believe it at first, but the more I see, the more I realize that it's alive. And it's been waiting for someone to come, someone who would awaken it." Emma's blood ran cold. The realization hit her like a blow to the chest. She had known, deep down, that the orphanage had been more than it seemed, but the truth was so much worse than she had feared. It wasn't just haunted by the spirits of the past. It was a living entity, a parasite that fed on the fear and misery of the children it had claimed over the years. And now, it was awake, and it had set its sights on them. "We've awoken it," Emma repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. She looked back at the altar, now glowing brighter, more insistent, as if calling them forward. The voices, too, seemed to be urging them toward it. "We need to stop it. We need to finish this." But the task was far from simple. The ground trembled again, and the darkness within the walls seemed to swell like a rising tide. The air turned thick and oppressive, pressing in on them from all sides. And from within the shadows, they saw it, movement shifting and twitching like something alive, something that had been hidden away for far too long. From the depths of the darkness, a figure slowly emerged. At first, it was a blur, just a shape in the gloom. But as it grew closer, it became more defined. It was tall, impossibly tall, its body twisted and contorted in unnatural angles. Its skin was pale, stretched tight over bones that seemed far too long and sharp. It had no eyes, only smooth, empty sockets, but its presence was more terrifying than anything they had ever encountered. It was an embodiment of darkness itself, a physical manifestation of the orphanage's twisted soul. Emma's heart raced. She wanted to scream, to run, but she couldn't move. She was paralyzed, rooted to the spot by the sheer horror of what was happening. And as the figure drew closer, she realized with growing horror that it was no longer just a manifestation of evil. It was the orphanage itself. It had taken form, it was alive, and it was coming for them. "We have to destroy it," Lily whispered, her voice filled with the kind of dread that only comes when a person faces something truly impossible. But how? Emma didn't know. The answer was buried in the recesses of her mind, just out of reach. And all she could do was watch as the thing that had once been the orphanage came closer, the air thick with its oppressive, suffocating energy. And then, in a moment of sheer clarity, Emma understood. The key. It wasn't just a key to the orphanage. It was a key to something greater. Something that could bind this creature, this living entity, back to the darkness from which it came. She held the key tightly in her hand and stepped forward, the rest of them following her with a hesitant, yet desperate resolve. It was time to end this. But even as she approached the altar, Emma knew that the battle they faced wasn't just with the orphanage. It was with everything they had ever feared, everything they had ever imagined, and perhaps even more. The oppressive silence that followed the appearance of the creature was broken only by the erratic pulse of the altar's energy. The creature, if one could even call it that, loomed over them, its presence suffocating and unnatural. Its limbs twisted grotesquely, each movement an unsettling sound, as though bones were bending and snapping in ways they should not. The eyes, those vacant, black holes, seemed to see everything and nothing at once. In that moment, Emma understood the true nature of the being before them. It wasn't just an entity. It was an ancient horror, an embodiment of the very darkness the orphanage had been hiding for generations. Emma's grip on the key tightened. The air around her crackled with an energy that felt almost alive, like the building itself was holding its breath. The walls trembled, groaned, and shifted as though they were alive in a way that mirrored the entity. The orphanage wasn't just a house for the lost and the forgotten. It was a prison that held something far older, far more dangerous than anyone had ever known. She could feel it now, the weight of it pressing against her chest. The key, this relic, was the only thing that could undo what had been done. Her heart pounded in her ears as she took a step toward the altar. The creature seemed to react, its limbs twitching in a violent spasm, as though it were aware of the key in her hand. "It's a trap," she thought. "It's a trap, but what choice do we have?" She glanced at her friends, their faces etched with fear, their eyes wide and filled with uncertainty. Thomas, Lily, and the others were frozen, their legs rooted to the floor as the entity loomed closer, its shadow stretching out to engulf them. "Emma, wait!" Thomas's voice cracked through the tension, but Emma didn't stop. She couldn't afford to hesitate. Not now. Not when everything was on the line. The key was their only hope, and if she failed, they would all be lost. With one final breath, she stepped forward, her hand trembling as she extended the key toward the altar. As soon as it touched the stone surface, the energy in the room shifted. The air grew colder, the light from the altar flashing violently before it settled into a steady, intense glow. For a moment, Emma felt as though the entire world had stopped. Time itself seemed to hang suspended, and she could hear nothing but the pounding of her own heart. The key hummed in her hand, its energy pulsing, matching the rhythm of the heartbeat in the walls. The creature screeched, a sound so raw, so primal, it felt as though the very fabric of reality was being torn apart. The sound reverberated in her bones, shaking her to her core. She stumbled back, clutching the key even tighter, as if it were her only anchor in a world gone mad. But the altar did not relent. It glowed brighter, its light now blinding. The energy in the room became unbearable, pressing in from all sides, until Emma could no longer breathe. It felt as though the room itself was folding in on her, closing in from every angle. "Emma, what's happening?" Lily's voice was muffled, as though coming from far away. But Emma couldn't respond. She couldn't focus on anything except the blinding light and the thundering force that seemed to be pulling her in, drawing her deeper into the altar's power. The key hummed louder now, almost like a chant, and Emma realized with sudden clarity that it wasn't just an object. It was a vessel, a conduit for an ancient force. And it was pulling her in. With an effort that felt like fighting against a storm, Emma forced herself to take one more step forward. She could feel the energy of the key merge with her own. And then, suddenly, the room was silent. The pulsating energy stopped. The hum of the key ceased. The creature's screeching vanished. Emma opened her eyes, blinking against the afterimage of the light that still lingered in her vision. The creature had stopped. It stood motionless, its twisted form frozen in place. The energy in the room had changed. It was no longer oppressive, no longer suffocating. Instead, it felt heavy, like the weight of an ancient silence pressing down on them. Emma turned to look at her friends. They, too, were staring at the creature, their faces wide with disbelief. It's gone," Lily whispered, her voice trembling. But Emma knew better. The creature wasn't gone. Not entirely. It was bound, its movements restricted, but its presence remained, lingering like a shadow over them all. The key had done its work, but the victory felt hollow. She had managed to bind the creature to the altar, to the very walls of the orphanage. But Emma knew that binding was not the same as destroying. The creature was still there, still waiting, and in that moment, she understood that the orphanage itself was not just a prison for the lost children. It was a prison for this malevolent force. And no matter how they had tried to stop it, it would always find a way to return. She turned back to the altar, the key still warm in her hand. The relic had done what it was meant to do, but at a cost. Emma felt a strange sense of emptiness, like a piece of her soul had been taken. The room around them seemed to stretch and warp as the silence pressed in. This was only a temporary reprieve. The orphanage, the entity, it would rise again. Emma knew it was only a matter of time. "Is it really over?" Thomas asked, his voice hoarse. "I don't think so," Emma replied, her eyes fixed on the altar. "We've only just begun to understand what's happening here. The orphanage isn't just a building. It's a part of something far older, far more dangerous. We may have bound it, but the true battle is still ahead. And so, the first victory felt like nothing more than a fleeting moment. The key's power had been enough to stop the creature, but Emma understood that the orphanage was far from finished. Whatever evil resided here had not been vanquished. It had merely been subdued, contained, waiting. The true horror was yet to come. The silence that had enveloped the orphanage after Emma's desperate act began to feel suffocating. The air, still thick with energy from the altar, seemed to pulse with an otherworldly weight that pressed down on the group. They stood in a circle, their eyes wide, hearts racing, unsure of what had truly happened. The creature, though still bound by the altar's magic, loomed over them in a way that was hard to ignore. It was as if they had awakened something darker, something that had been hidden in the very bones of the building for centuries. Emma felt the weight of the silence more than anyone. Though they had succeeded in halting the creature's rampage, she knew the victory was a temporary one. The battle had only just begun, and the danger that had been unleashed was more than they could comprehend. With the key still clenched tightly in her hand, she felt an eerie connection to the very fabric of the orphanage. An unsettling awareness that the place itself was not merely a home for abandoned children, but a prison. A prison designed to hold something much worse than any of them had ever imagined. "The building, it's alive," Emma whispered, her voice barely audible. The words felt wrong in her mouth, but they were true. It was as though the orphanage itself was watching them, listening. The creaking of the floorboards, the groan of the walls, the flickering of the lights, all of it seemed to pulse with a life of its own. The sense of unease was growing stronger with every passing second. Thomas took a step closer to Emma, his face pale but resolute. "You don't mean it in a literal sense, do you?" His voice was low, trying to make sense of what had just happened. "The creature is bound, and the key, it did something to stop it." Emma shook her head. "I don't know. I feel it. Something's wrong. The key. Yes, it stopped the creature. But it didn't end what's happening here. The orphanage, this place, it's part of something older, something much darker. Lily, who had been standing to the side, shuddered. What do we do now? We can't just leave it like this. We don't even know what we're up against. Emma turned toward her, her eyes reflecting a deep, unsettling understanding. We need to uncover what's been hidden here. There's more to this orphanage than we've been told. The creature wasn't the only thing it was built to contain. The truth is still buried beneath the floors, inside these walls. The realization that the orphanage itself was more than just a building, more than a home, began to settle over them like a thick fog. This place, once a refuge for orphaned children, was in truth a vessel for something far more sinister. Emma felt a gnawing sensation deep within her chest, as if a door was creaking open somewhere inside her, revealing the darker truths she had always sensed but never fully understood. It was then that Emma noticed something odd. The air had grown colder, and the shadows around them seemed to shift unnaturally. The walls, once firm and stable, now appeared to breathe, expanding and contracting as if the building itself were living, growing. The floor beneath them groaned as though it were alive. It was a sensation that Emma could feel deep in her bones, a vibration that matched the pulse of the key in her hand. She had never felt anything like it before. The group exchanged uneasy glances. They all felt it now, the creeping sense that the very building they had relied on for safety was betraying them. The air was thick with an ancient presence, one that had lain dormant for years, only to be stirred awake by their actions. "We need to get out of here," Thomas said urgently, his voice rising in panic. "Whatever's happening, it's not safe." Emma met his gaze with a steady, determined look. "We can't leave." "Not yet. There's something in this place, something we need to understand. If we leave now, we're just delaying the inevitable. The creature was only a part of it. We need to uncover what's really going on here." Lily swallowed hard, her throat dry. "But how do we even begin to understand any of this? Where do we start?" "The basement," Emma said quietly, her voice filled with a strange certainty. She had no idea why, but something inside her told her that the answers lay there. Beneath the building, hidden in the darkest corners of the orphanage, there was something they hadn't yet discovered. "The basement is where it all began. We need to go there." The others hesitated, but Emma's conviction was undeniable. The key in her hand, still warm with power, seemed to hum in response to her words, as though urging her forward. They had come this far, had already faced unspeakable horrors, and Emma knew that to stop it once and for all, they had to confront the truth buried deep within the heart of the orphanage. The basement was a place of secrets, secrets that had been sealed away, hidden in darkness. Emma knew that whatever lay there was not just a part of the orphanage's history, but the key to understanding the true evil they were dealing with. The creature was only one manifestation of it, but there was more. Something older, something darker, and something far more dangerous. And Emma was determined to uncover it, no matter the cost. With her friends following her, Emma made her way toward the basement, their steps heavy and slow, as though the very air around them was trying to pull them back. The door to the stairs creaked open, and the darkness below seemed to welcome them like an old, familiar friend. They stepped into the abyss, unsure of what they would find, but certain that it was the only path that could lead them to the truth. As Emma descended the creaking staircase into the basement, she could feel a weight pressing down on her chest. The air was thick, oppressive, and the darkness seemed to press in on all sides. The flickering light above their heads barely cut through the void, casting long, wavering shadows across the walls. Each step echoed loudly in the silence, making it feel as though the basement was alive, listening to their every movement. It was a sensation Emma couldn't shake, as if something within the very bones of the orphanage were awakening, responding to their presence. The others followed closely behind, their faces pale and apprehensive, but none dared to speak. The basement was colder than the rest of the building, and the temperature seemed to drop with each step they took. Emma could feel her breath turning to fog in front of her, a sure sign of the unnatural chill in the air. It was as though the darkness itself was freezing them, holding them captive in this forgotten part of the orphanage. The more she moved, the more she felt the growing sense that they were walking into something far beyond their understanding. When they finally reached the bottom of the stairs, the scene before them was unlike anything they had expected. The basement was vast, stretching far beyond the confines of the orphanage above. The walls were covered in layers of grime and dust, the air thick with the smell of mold and rot. But it wasn't just the disrepair that caught their attention. It was the presence of something unnatural. At the far end of the basement, an enormous iron door loomed. It was ancient, its surface marred by rust and time, and yet it seemed to pulse with a strange, eerie energy. Emma couldn't explain it, but she knew that whatever lay beyond that door was the key to everything they had been searching for. "I've never seen this door before," Thomas murmured, his voice tinged with awe and fear. His hand hovered nervously over the hilt of his knife, as though preparing for an encounter with the unknown. "It was never meant to be seen," Emma replied, her voice steady despite the pounding of her heart. "This is where it all began." The key in her hand warmed, reacting to the proximity of the door. Emma could feel its pull, as though the two were connected by something far older and more powerful than she could comprehend. The door was not just a barrier. It was a threshold, a boundary between the known and the unknown. She knew, with an undeniable certainty, that once they crossed this threshold, there would be no turning back. With trembling hands, Emma approached the door. The others stood behind her, waiting, watching, unsure of what to do. Emma took a deep breath, steeling herself for whatever lay beyond. She inserted the key into the lock, feeling it click with a loud, resounding echo. The door creaked open slowly, its hinges groaning in protest, as if it had not been moved in centuries. Beyond the door lay a vast chamber, its size impossible to fully comprehend in the dim light. The air was thick with the scent of ancient decay, and the floor was covered in layers of dust and cobwebs. But what truly caught Emma's attention was the altar in the center of the room. It was made of stone, intricately carved with symbols that seemed to shift and change when she looked at them. The altar was surrounded by a ring of candles, all of which were long extinguished, leaving the room in an unsettling darkness. And at the center of the altar, there was something else, something far more terrifying. A figure lay motionless on the altar, its body twisted and contorted in unnatural angles. Emma's breath caught in her throat as she recognized the form. It was a child, but not like any child she had ever seen. Its skin was pale and stretched tight across its bones, its eyes wide open but completely blank. It looked almost skeletal, its features distorted and malformed, as though it had been twisted into something otherworldly. The figure was a grotesque mockery of life, a body that had been left to decay in the darkness for an eternity. "This is wrong," Lily whispered, her voice trembling. "What is this? Why is it here?" Emma took a cautious step forward, her gaze fixed on the child's form. This is what the orphanage was built to protect. This is what the key was meant to seal away. The others fell silent, their faces filled with a mix of horror and disbelief. They had come here searching for answers, but they had not been prepared for this. The realization that the orphanage itself had been built to contain something so horrific, so unimaginable, that it had been hidden away for centuries. The creature they had encountered earlier was not the source of the darkness. It was only a symptom, a manifestation of something far more ancient and insidious. Emma's mind raced as she tried to piece together the fragments of knowledge she had gathered. The orphanage, built on top of an ancient burial ground, had been constructed with one purpose in mind: to imprison the creature that lay before them. But the creature was not simply a beast. It was something much darker. It was a force, a malevolent entity that fed on the fear and suffering of children, a parasite that thrived on their misery. And for centuries, it had been kept locked away, hidden from the world above. But now, something had changed. The creature was stirring, awakening from its long slumber. And as it awoke, it would bring with it a flood of horrors, unleashing chaos and destruction upon the orphanage and anyone who dared to enter. "We need to stop it," Emma said, her voice filled with a newfound determination. "We have to finish what was started. We can't let it spread any further." The others nodded, their fear momentarily replaced by a shared resolve. They had come this far, and they couldn't back down now. The answers they sought were within their grasp, but the cost of uncovering them would be high. They would have to confront the creature at the heart of the orphanage, face its twisted power, and end its reign of terror once and for all. But first, they had to understand what it was, what it wanted, and how to destroy it. As Emma took another step toward the altar, she could feel the presence of the creature grow stronger. It was as if it were aware of their presence, watching them, waiting. The darkness in the room seemed to pulse with a life of its own, as if the very walls were closing in around them. The final confrontation was near. The air in the chamber grew thick with tension, and Emma could feel her heart pounding in her chest. Every inch of her being screamed at her to turn back, to leave this accursed place behind. But she knew, deep down, that there was no escaping it now. The orphanage had kept its secrets hidden for far too long, and now they were finally being revealed, unleashing horrors that no one could have anticipated. She was standing at the threshold of an ancient evil, one that had been buried beneath layers of time and history, waiting for the right moment to awaken. And that moment had arrived. As Emma stepped closer to the altar, the air grew colder, and a low hum filled the room. It was a sound that seemed to vibrate through her very bones, sending shivers of unease down her spine. The child on the altar, its twisted form eerily still, was the source of that hum. Though its eyes were empty, they seemed to hold a dark, knowing gaze, as though it were aware of the intruders in its domain. It wasn't just a body. It was the vessel, the conduit, through which something far darker could emerge. The sense of wrongness was overwhelming, and yet Emma could not tear her eyes away. "What is it?" Lily whispered, her voice trembling with fear. "What happened to it?" Emma could hardly answer, for she wasn't sure she fully understood herself. It was clear now that the creature they had encountered earlier, the one that had stalked the orphanage halls, its grotesque appearance and inhuman movements, was no mere monster. It was a manifestation of the force that had been locked away in the depths of the orphanage for centuries. The creature was not the true threat, but the result of an ancient curse, a malevolent force that fed on fear, pain, and death. And now, with the creature stirring, the force was awakening again, breaking free from its prison. The basement was no longer just a room filled with dust and decay. It had become a threshold, a gateway between the physical world and something far more terrifying. The walls of the room seemed to shift, warping and bending as though the space itself were becoming unhinged. The hum grew louder, a rising crescendo of power, and Emma could feel her own mind begin to unravel, the edges of her thoughts blurring as the darkness pressed in closer. It was as if the very air itself had become thick with dread, a substance that clung to their skin and made it hard to breathe. Thomas stepped forward cautiously, his hand reaching out to Emma as if to pull her back. "Emma, we need to leave. Now! We've seen enough." But Emma didn't move. She couldn't. There was something about the altar, something about the child's form that held her in place, as though the room itself were magnetized to her presence. She couldn't look away, couldn't tear herself free from the pull of that terrible silence. "No," she whispered. "We have to understand it. We have to finish what was started." It was then that the child on the altar moved, just slightly, but enough to send a jolt of terror through the group. Its body twisted and groaned, as though it were being pulled by unseen forces. Emma watched in horror as its fingers twitched, curling into claws. And then its eyes, those empty, soulless eyes, blinked. The hum in the room intensified, vibrating through Emma's entire being, and the child's mouth stretched into an unnatural grin. "No," Emma breathed, stumbling back in shock. "It's waking up. It's not dead. It's been waiting." Suddenly, the room was filled with the sound of grinding metal. The iron door that had once stood behind them slammed shut with a deafening noise, trapping them inside. The light in the room flickered, casting erratic shadows that danced on the walls like sinister figures. It was as if the very foundation of the orphanage had decided to come alive to fight back against their intrusion. "Damn it," Thomas cursed, his hand reaching for the door's handle. But no matter how hard he pulled, the door wouldn't budge. It was as though it had been sealed from the other side, ensuring that they would not escape. Emma turned back to the altar, her thoughts racing. The creature, the force, it was far more powerful than they had anticipated. They had walked right into its lair, and now they were trapped, with no clear way of escaping. The child's form continued to twitch and writhe, its body contorting in ways that were impossible for any living thing. It was as though it were trying to break free of its human shell to become something else, something monstrous. As the creature's form began to shift and grow, Emma's mind raced. The altar, the child, it was all part of a ritual, a dark, ancient ceremony that had been performed long ago to bind the entity to this place. The child was never meant to be an innocent victim. It was a vessel that had been chosen to contain the evil. And now that the vessel was weakening, the entity was making its move. The basement, the orphanage, it had all been constructed around this very moment when the evil would finally be unleashed. "No matter what we do, it's too late," Emma whispered, a sense of cold resignation settling over her. "We can't stop it." But as she spoke, a sudden sound pierced the air, the sound of scratching, scurrying, like the rustling of paper or the movement of 1,000 tiny feet. It was coming from all around them, from the walls, the floors, and the ceiling. The shadows, once still and oppressive, seemed to come alive, swirling and twisting in the corners of the room. And then, without warning, they lunged toward them. Lily screamed as the shadows enveloped her, their cold tendrils wrapping around her body. She struggled, but the shadows only tightened their grip, pulling her deeper into the darkness. Emma reached out in a desperate attempt to save her, but it was too late. In a moment, Lily vanished, swallowed whole by the darkness. The room fell silent once more, but the hum from the altar continued to grow, louder and louder, until it felt like the walls themselves were vibrating. Emma's heart raced as she realized the horrifying truth. The creature was no longer just a physical form. It was feeding off their fear, off the terror that had taken root in the orphanage. It was alive, more alive than ever before, and it was only a matter of time before it spread. "We have to stop it," Emma said, her voice a quiet but determined whisper, "before it's too late." But with Lily lost and the darkness closing in, Emma wasn't sure she had the strength to fight back anymore. The evil was far more powerful than she had imagined, and it had only just begun its reign of terror. The battle for the orphanage, for their lives, was far from over. It was only just beginning. The room seemed to pulse with a new rhythm, one that matched the frantic beating of Emma's heart. The shadows, still thick and oppressive, now seemed to move of their own accord, skittering across the floor like spiders on the hunt. The silence between the faint hum from the altar and the unsettling movements of the darkness was deafening. Emma's mind reeled as she tried to process everything that had happened. The shadows had consumed Lily, their dark tendrils pulling her into some netherworld of torment and suffering, and Emma had barely managed to survive the encounter. Now, trapped in the heart of the orphanage's nightmare, she realized the horrifying truth. There was no escape. The door that had once held the promise of safety now served as a prison. It had been sealed with an invisible force, one that Emma could not begin to understand. No matter how much force Thomas exerted, the door remained unyielding, an iron barrier that mocked their attempts. The air grew thicker, the walls pressing in, squeezing the last bit of hope from their bodies. The once silent corners of the room now buzzed with an unsettling presence, as though they were alive, watching their every move. Emma turned back to the altar, her gaze drawn to the thing that lay there. The child's form had changed. It no longer resembled the innocent face of a lost soul, but instead appeared as a twisted reflection of what it had once been. The child's eyes were wide open, black pits where nothing existed but darkness. The form writhed on the altar, the hum of power surrounding it growing stronger, an energy so dark it made the air crackle with malevolence. Emma could feel the weight of its presence pushing against her chest, making it harder to breathe. There was no doubt now. The creature was growing stronger, evolving into something far worse than they could ever have anticipated. It wasn't just a child anymore. It was the culmination of all the fear, the suffering, and the pain that the orphanage had witnessed over the years. It was the physical manifestation of all the horrors that had been buried beneath its walls. Emma could feel it in the air. This was no longer just about survival. The creature was feeding off their fear, gaining strength with each passing second, and Emma could sense that it was preparing to fully manifest. She shuddered, knowing that if they did not act soon, they would all be lost to its darkness. "We have to get out of here, Emma." Thomas's voice was filled with a quiet desperation as he reached out to her, his eyes wild with fear. "If we stay any longer, we'll be consumed too." But Emma shook her head, her mind racing with the knowledge that there was no escape. They had entered a web of malevolent forces, and the threads were closing in around them. Every corner of the orphanage had been designed to keep them trapped, to feed the entity that had been waiting for this moment. There was no simple way out, no escape hatch they could pull open to find safety. The creature knew them now. It had seen their faces, tasted their fear, and it wasn't going to let them go. "Thomas, we're already too late," she said, her voice trembling as she turned toward him. "It's feeding off us now. We can't outrun it." The words hung heavy in the air. Emma's heart sank as she spoke them, the realization of their grim fate sinking in. She had thought that by uncovering the truth about the orphanage, about the cursed history and the dark rituals that had been performed, they could break the cycle. But it was clear now that the orphanage had never intended for anyone to survive. They were pawns in a game that had been played for centuries. Their fear was its fuel, and as long as they remained trapped inside, the creature would continue to grow stronger. Suddenly, a sharp cry echoed through the air. Emma turned toward the source of the sound, her eyes wide with horror as she saw a figure emerging from the shadows. It was Lily, or what had once been Lily. Her body was contorted, her limbs twisted at unnatural angles, and her eyes glowed with an eerie, unnatural light. She moved slowly, deliberately, her steps dragging as though she were tethered to the shadows themselves. She opened her mouth, but the words that came out were not her own. They were guttural, a language older than time itself, a language that seemed to vibrate through the very air. The darkness around her seemed to deepen as she spoke, and Emma felt the weight of the curse pressing in from all sides. "Lily, no!" Emma cried out, but it was too late. The girl, or whatever she had become, advanced toward them with terrifying speed, her body shifting and morphing as though she were part of the shadows themselves. The creature, the force, had claimed her entirely. Thomas grabbed Emma's arm, pulling her back as Lily's twisted form lunged toward them. But before they could move, the room itself seemed to respond. The walls buckled inward, the ceiling groaning as though the building itself were alive and reacting to the creature's awakening. The ground beneath them trembled, and Emma's vision blurred as the lights flickered and sparked. The shadows in the room swirled with increasing intensity, a tempest of darkness that threatened to devour everything in its path. Emma stumbled backward, her thoughts a blur of panic. It wasn't just the orphanage that was falling apart. It was the very fabric of reality itself. The evil that had been sealed away for centuries was tearing through the walls, and nothing, not even the natural laws of the world, could contain it any longer. "What do we do now?" Thomas's voice was barely audible, his eyes filled with terror. "We can't fight it. It's too strong." But Emma knew that there was one thing left to do. They had no choice but to confront the entity. There was no escaping the orphanage's grasp, no running from the nightmare that had unfolded around them. The ritual that had begun was nearing its final stages, and if they did not act now, they would become permanent fixtures in the curse's twisted history. "We have to destroy the mirror," Emma said, her voice firm with determination, despite the fear that clung to every word. "It's the key. The mirror." Before she could finish, the ground shook again, a violent tremor that sent them both crashing to the floor. A deafening roar echoed through the orphanage, and Emma could feel the pulse of the darkness grow stronger. It was coming for them, coming to claim them as it had claimed Lily. They had to find the mirror before it was too late, before the orphanage consumed them all. The clock was ticking, and the creature was getting closer. The fight for survival had entered its final phase, and Emma knew that only one thing could stop the curse now: the mirror. But where was it? Where was the one object that could sever the bond between the creature and the orphanage? Emma's mind raced as she pushed herself to her feet, the adrenaline flooding her veins. She couldn't waste any more time. They had to find it. As Emma and Thomas sprinted through the darkened halls of the orphanage, the air around them seemed to grow colder, denser with every step. The building, once a place of forgotten memories and twisted histories, had transformed into something more, a living entity, feeding off their fear, their desperation, and now, their very hope. The walls seemed to close in, narrowing their path, and the floor beneath their feet trembled as if the orphanage itself were alive, aware of their every movement. The presence of the creature, no longer a mere shadow, but something far more sinister, lingered behind them, just beyond their reach. Its hunger was insatiable, its grasp relentless. The mirror, Emma realized, was their only hope. She could feel its presence, somewhere deep within the heart of the building, drawing her forward like a magnet. The creature's power grew with every passing moment, and with it, the very fabric of reality seemed to unravel. The orphanage was not just a physical space anymore. It was a battleground, where the laws of nature had no place, where time itself seemed to bend and stretch, as if caught in the grip of something far beyond human understanding. The mirror held the key to undoing it all: the curse, the darkness, the creature that had once been a child. It had all been tied to the glass, to the reflection that had captured the essence of the orphanage's malevolent soul. Emma and Thomas reached the room at the farthest corner of the building, the one that had always been locked. It was here, in the center of the room, that the mirror stood. But what they saw before them was not the simple, dusty reflection of the past they had expected. The mirror shimmered with an unnatural light, its surface rippling like the surface of water, distorting their reflections. There was no longer any trace of the orphanage in the reflection, only a void, a deep, endless darkness that seemed to stretch forever. "The mirror," Thomas whispered, his voice trembling. "It's changed. It's not what we thought it was." But Emma knew better than to trust what she saw. The mirror had always been more than a mere object of reflection. It had been a portal, a window to something far more sinister. It had served as the keeper of the orphanage's dark secrets, its silent witness to every twisted ritual, every sacrifice. Now it was the threshold to the final confrontation. The creature had been waiting for this moment, for Emma to arrive at this very point. And as she stepped closer to the mirror, she could feel its malevolent energy surge. The air grew thick with tension, and the ground beneath them seemed to quake in response. It was then that the voice echoed through the room, a low, guttural sound, as if coming from the depths of the earth itself. "You cannot stop what has already begun." Emma's breath caught in her throat as she looked toward the reflection in the mirror. The child, or what had once been a child, stood there, its eyes black pits of endless void, its form now a grotesque mockery of innocence. It was no longer trapped in the glass. It had emerged, and with it, the full force of the darkness that had haunted the orphanage for centuries. The creature's form shifted and writhed, its limbs distorting, growing longer, more grotesque with every passing second. It was not just a reflection. It was real, and it was coming for them. "Emma!" Thomas shouted, pulling her away from the mirror. "We have to do something. We can't just look at it. It will..." But Emma's mind was racing. She couldn't allow fear to overtake her. Not now. They had come this far, and the creature had made one fatal mistake. It had underestimated their determination. The mirror, with all its terrifying power, was still an object of reflection. It could be used against the creature, just as it had once been used to imprison it. The darkness could not survive the light. She had seen it before, in the way the shadows had recoiled when they first encountered the truth. She didn't know how, but she knew what had to be done. The mirror could be the final weapon they needed to break the curse. Without thinking, Emma reached for the mirror's frame, her fingers brushing against the cold glass. The moment her skin made contact, the room seemed to explode with light, and the air was filled with an unearthly hum. The creature screamed, its form distorting violently as the light from the mirror seemed to pierce the very essence of its being. For the briefest moment, Emma thought she saw the child, the innocent face of the orphanage's first victim, looking back at her, pleading for mercy. But the mercy was not for the creature. It was for the souls it had trapped over the years. The souls that had been twisted, corrupted, consumed by its insatiable hunger. The mirror trembled in her hands as it glowed brighter and brighter, its light spilling out into the room, filling every corner, every shadow. The creature howled in fury, its form contorting in agony as the light tore through the darkness that had claimed it. Emma could feel the weight of the mirror's power, the pull of the curse fighting against her, but she held firm. She couldn't falter now. This was the end, the final reckoning. If she released the mirror's full potential, the curse would be broken, the creature banished forever. With a final cry, the creature collapsed into a mass of writhing shadows, its form dissolving into nothingness as the light from the mirror grew unbearable. Emma squeezed her eyes shut against the blinding radiance, her hands still gripping the frame. The air around her seemed to snap, and the world seemed to collapse in on itself. She had done it. The curse was broken. When the light finally faded, Emma slowly opened her eyes. The room was silent, eerily still. The mirror stood before her, its surface now clear and smooth, reflecting only the empty room. The air no longer felt heavy with the presence of the creature. The orphanage, once a place of terror, seemed to have reclaimed a semblance of peace. The darkness had lifted, and the oppressive weight that had haunted the building for so long was gone. But as Emma turned to Thomas, her body trembling from the ordeal, she realized that their journey had come at a terrible cost. The orphanage was free, but the price of that freedom had been steep. The memories of those who had suffered there, the souls lost to the darkness, lingered in the air. They would never be forgotten, nor would the terror that had once reigned there. Emma and Thomas had survived, but the scars of their experience would remain with them forever. And as they left the orphanage behind, the door finally swinging open for the first time in years, Emma knew that the battle against the darkness had been won. But she also knew that evil could never truly be erased. It would always find a way to return in one form or another. The mirror had been the key to breaking the curse, but in its reflection, she saw that there would always be a shadow waiting to rise again. The true fight was not over. It had only just begun.